Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering the Mage Errant series wrap-up. In this episode, I'm not even sure what I'm going to talk about. The series as a whole, what I felt about it. Maybe Dan has some questions or some tidbits to share with me. We'll see, kiddos, but this is the first time I've really done a wrap-up episode by myself, so I don't know how it's going to be. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. I say that I haven't done one of these before, but actually I think I did a wrap-up for Cradle, if I'm not mistaken. And a lot of that was because the Cradle chat was pretty packed a lot of the time. And folks had a lot of questions, suggestions, news tidbits, and whatnot going on. And, for Mage Errant, I have pretty much had Dan, Emic Shard, and Ms. T, who I'm not sure is here today, but I think Eduardo was also somebody who frequently turned up for these. So if you guys have questions for me, please feel free. But I'm just going to, kind of talk in general about how I felt about the series. It's really it's one of those that I feel similar to as I do about Brandon Sanderson, where I think it's extremely well done, but it focuses on a lot of things that are not particularly my bag. So I definitely understand its appeal, and I respect how well thought out it all is. But there are a lot of places where I'm yeah, but I want to know more about this other thing. You know what I mean? That said, I do really enjoy that the characters are they are people who think things through. They are people who communicate. And I love that the author does not depend on silly misunderstandings and people behaving like children and throwing tantrums over things for plot. He created a plot that one could say, I suppose, that Alustin threw a bit of a tantrum. He did in response to that letter, but also the grudge that he had been holding was so long-standing and so understandable. His people were annihilated, the entire, you know what I mean? That despite all of the horrific shit he did, the scale of what he was attempting to avenge did feel proportional to what he was trying to do in a way. The scale of what he believed he was attempting, not what it looks like he was actually going to do because he didn't fully understand the nature of the Tongue Eater. I also really have to mention too, I think about this a lot, how mistrustful I was of Candoron. You guys remember, I feel like it was book 3 or 4, and I was really starting to be what is her deal? I don't like this. I feel like she's leading Hugh along, and that she's hiding things, and it turns out she definitely was. But it wasn't the type of plot that I was expecting. I was unwilling to believe that a character with the kind of power that she had actually had the good of others at heart. I was just life isn't like that, which is an unfortunate place to be mentally, that I really was it's simply out of the question. Of course, she's not just trying to do the right thing. Why would she? She can do whatever she wants, and people who can do whatever they want very rarely give a shit about anybody else. And the few times that Hugh talked to her about what her motivations were, and her losing her family, there was such a sense of bitterness over it that I thought she was in like sort of the same headspace as Alestin turned out to be. But it turns out that she had kind of, I won't say she had grown past it, because ultimately she was attempting to take down Havath. It was simply that she had a lot more patience about how it was done and a much longer term view of things, which, to be fair, she could have, because she is extremely old and looks to be living God knows how much longer. And Alestin doesn't have the long life awaiting him, I don't think, unless what she's done with bringing him into the library. But at the time, I don't believe that he was looking at living long enough to see Havath actually crumble himself. And the knowledge that it eventually would was not enough, which I do understand, you know, like, Dan asks, which book was your favorite? Ooh, that's a really good question. I'm going to go into my library and just make sure that I have all of the names of the books completely at the top of my head, because you know how that can be. And you're probably going to have to refresh me, since I did go through them the way that I did, as to like what exactly happened in every book. But I can't help but feel a little bit partial to Jewel of the Endless Urg, simply because it was like one of the first where we really got to see outside of Skyhold, and there was such a, the city felt very real to me. Indris was so like overwhelmingly impressive. The combination of there being a natural event that was an emergency and there being a coup, I really enjoyed like the way all of that was structured. Lost City of Ithos, though, that's a pretty good one. Like, you know, it's a road trip. It's getting to see all of these bizarre places. It's the weirdness of the nature of how Ithos returns to the world, and the well thought out nature of like how the way that it was separated, the way that people forgot about it. And also, I believe at the end of that one is when we have that like fake out with the cold mines, which is pretty fucking dope. So I feel like probably Lost City of Ithos wins, but I really like Jewel of the Endless Urg. I also like as well in Jewel that Hugh is dealing with Ava and like his feelings about her and all of that. And he navigates that with some, I was going to say aplomb, but that's really too generous. He navigates it with more maturity than I was expecting, based on how teenage romances tend to go. I feel like they don't actually split until Traitor and Skyhold, though, right? Is that when they break up? Like, is it before, or I'm trying to remember how that went. Because, like, it was when things began to really pop off that she was like, okay, you guys are about that life, and I'm not really, I don't feel it. Let me see. Oh, there's a bunch of chat. So, MX Shard says, a question from me. What sort of affinity would you want to have in this setting? I have thought about that so often. And I cannot decide what I would want. Like, there's a part of me that immediately thinks about, oh my God, what is the name of the non-binary flashy one? They have just such a vibe that sound magic just feels like, well, I identify very strongly with this. I mean, being a shit mage makes you the most money. And I can't deny, money is extremely useful. I would not mind it. However, I don't know how much I'm willing to deal with shit. I can get real squicked out pretty easily about things. So I feel like I couldn't. I just couldn't. And it's interesting too, because if I pick an affinity, you can get so granular with that, you know? Like, the fiber mage thing is really, really fascinating. I also love to cook. So the smell, scent, I think maybe scent affinity. Not only because it could be useful in cooking, but it's just such a weird one with such strange applications that I feel like it would be fun to experiment with how that would work. I don't, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, but I feel like that has the most, can you get more granular with that? Like, can you be only attuned to a particular type of scent, or is it just scent as a scent in general? Yeah, I feel like scent is a fun one that can be used in a aggressive way, but it doesn't have to be. And I like that it's something that can be used creatively, or it can be used in combat. I don't really feel in any universe that I would be somebody who's in battle. I'm not the type, I'm just not. I am a hobbit, really. I'm not a dwarf. So I'm going to pick something that's a bit more of a homebody affinity. Yeah, I feel like that would be the one, though. I think scent. Per my own question, I would love to see what sorts of sweets I could make or bake with a sugar affinity. Oh, that's fun. A cheese affinity. I wouldn't mind a cheese affinity there. Sure, if we're going to get down to food. But yeah, sugar affinity would be really fun. A chocolate affinity. You could make some really cool sculptures. Get Wonka-like. Dan says, a Lustin with a Cometrian paper mecha is my hope for the next series. Oh my god. That never occurred to me, but a mech would be right in his wheelhouse. Oh man, that would be really funny. Look, I'm going to be honest. I am glad Alestin is still alive despite myself. But I don't want to see him being a badass creative all too soon. I know that's the mission he's been sent on. I think it's the right choice. He's the one for the job. I totally get it. But he has done so much harm that a big part of me is like, he needs to just sit and think about what he's done. The next time I see him, I want him to be in, like, not necessarily in solitary or anything, but somewhere just sitting and contemplating and attempting to make amends in some, albeit insufficient ways. Like, there's nothing he can do to actually make amends for all of the death and destruction and loss of trust that he caused. But I wouldn't mind seeing him trying to make it up to people. Now, I get that he's supposed to be dead, so nobody is able to, like, know it's coming from him. And all the more, that's sort of what I like about it. It's one thing for you to just do good because you want people to know you did it, but it's another to do good and know that you're never getting the credit for it at all. And so if he were able to just sort of be out here doing, like, acts of kindness, but in secret, I don't feel like I'm ready to see him just out here free fighting and having a good time. Do you know what I mean? So I'm very mixed feelings. MX Shard says, I like Candoron as a character. She's deeply flawed, but trying to be a better person, largely due to experiencing the consequences of her actions and being determined not to repeat her failures. True. And I think that was part of what I wasn't willing to believe. Like, in terms of me not trusting her, was that I felt like it was clear that she regretted some of the things that she had done and saw that she had been a person at one time that she didn't want to be again. But there is, and I don't remember exactly how this went, but there's a point where she is talking, I believe, one-on-one to Hugh, and she mentions a nickname that she used to have. And I think it's a nickname. And he doesn't ask her about it. And I believe at the time I was like, dude, how could you not follow up on that? Like, I would want to know everything. Like, how did she get that name? And it's the sort of thing where I've mentioned this before, but my own father was a guerrilla in Colombia. And he, I know, did a lot of pretty horrific things that he was not proud of. And I remember asking him one time, point blank, if he had ever killed anybody. And he just said, you ask too many questions. And I didn't fully appreciate at the time what a painful question that probably was. You know, that he didn't want to have that conversation. The point of his religion in a lot of ways was for him to move on from the things that he had done, to be washed clean of it and be able to continue like redeeming himself by his actions. And so I know that were Hugh to pursue that conversation with Candaron, it perhaps would not go very well. Maybe she just doesn't want to go down that road, which I would respect. But there was a part of me that felt like, you're the one who brought it up. You're the one who told him about the thing. And it almost seemed as if you didn't want to know the answer, you know? So there was just a sense for me of, I think some of my mistrust came from the fact that he didn't push her and ask more questions. He trusted her so much and cared about her so much that I felt like it was potentially blinding him to some of the flaws that could lead, you know? And ultimately, the fact that she was unwilling to really hear Alustin out, as she says, she feels like she sort of failed him and caused him to take the turn he did. He made his own choices. I don't really want to say that it's her fault, but it definitely feels a bit like she is, I don't know, did she just not trust Alustin? Is that why? Like, did she believe that he was going to get the wrong idea about her plans or be resentful, and that's why she didn't tell him? Like, that's really, I actually don't feel like I ever asked that question. I never stopped to wonder, why did she keep the interplanetary or inter-universe? Well, how would you call that? She kept it secret from him, and I have to assume it was simply just part of the rules, right? That you're not allowed to just talk about this with whoever. And him not being a member of whatever this council was prohibited him from getting involved. And that's fine. I mean, you've got to practice some discretion. But I wonder if there was any way that she could have assured him that she understood where he was coming from a little bit more convincingly. Because it really seems like ultimately he didn't believe that whatever she was doing was aggressive enough, right? And I wonder if there was a way to talk him out of his path of vengeance. It really feels in some ways like he didn't, I won't say that he didn't learn anything, but you guys, he was like in the midst of Havath as it was broken, looking around and telling the kids, it feels pretty good to me. There wasn't a huge sense of remorse on that front. It really felt more like, I regret doing things because of misinformation, because I didn't understand the weapon I was about to use, and setting things in motion that had to be undone at the risk of everyone. But I don't really regret the destruction of this entire nation. So I don't know if he could have been thwarted and kept from his path. He was out here, like, when we were in his POVs, we heard him thinking about how in his downtime he just liked to fantasize about creative ways to kill Havathi people. You know, I don't know that there's a way to like get through to a person like that without them actually going through the motions of their plan and seeing how it shakes out and affects their friends. MX Shard says, I love the vibe of Theristel. All the magic cities in the world is one of my favorite parts of the series. Yeah, they're really like the world building that he has done. And Rashawn and I talked about this in a recent episode of Song of Ice and Fire, and how you have to walk this like line with world building where you need to make it feel believable and full and real, but you also can't, forgive me guys, this is my dog. You can't treat the world building as storytelling itself. And we were discussing this because she felt like at times George R.R. Martin falls into the trap of treating the world building as story. And I think like John Bierce mostly manages to keep that from being a problem. Most of the world building that he does is key to understanding why certain priorities are held in certain places, the ways that magic works, there's a way of doing it. And there have been times where I feel like you can hold back. You don't need to tell me all of this. A lot of that has been more the history than the world itself. And I'm not sure if those would be categorized as world building. Like, you know, maybe it would be. But in terms of the actual like political landscape, the actual physical landscape, the ways that magic functions, I don't really feel like he overdid that too much. It was the stuff about like the intricacies of certain paths specifically that I was just like, you don't need to explain it. I really understand it that you want to. And I understand that you have put so much thought into the physics of this that you would like to stress the connection that this has with how physics actually works. But you've got to believe that I trust you at this point, and I don't need to hear every detail about how affecting this particular layer of rock and suddenly heating it will cause steam that will create a crack that will, I don't need all of that. Let's see. Dan says, I think mine has to be Skyhold, the incredible battle scenes, but also the gut punch of Archer dying and the betrayal back to back. The book just hit hard. Yeah, I could understand that. Being a human slash flesh mage, being able to just be in shape with no effort and be the ultimate doctor would be very satisfying. I totally agree in that it would be great to be able to like help people, but again, the squick factor of like healing, I don't know, guys, if I could get past it, if I just wound up with that affinity, I would help people. That would feel like a responsibility. That would be a duty of somebody who has that ability, right? I would feel an obligation. But if I'm choosing, I don't know that I want to fuck with that. I don't know. Maybe I would just befriend somebody and they could keep me in shape without me having to try. Emmerich Shard says, I loved Lost City of Ithos. All the magic setting building, the team facing off with Havath for the first time. It was a very fun book. Also, yeah, a body modification suitable affinity would be a godsend for trans folks like me. That's an interesting point that I hadn't considered. Ooh, interesting. I feel like Alestin needs to do some big penance and healing before I can really enjoy him in a protagonist role. But people trying to be better is always a thing I like to see in fiction. Agree on both counts. Ms. T says, what if for Alestin's rehab somehow the Havath survivors get credit for his good deeds? Just a thought. That is so, petty. It would kill him, I feel like. I don't know. There's a part of me that feels like the best thing for him to really feel the impact of what he had done would be to have something to transform his appearance and force him to live amongst the Havath refugees somewhere and just see them as people. I mean, that's like as close as, I've often said at this point, instilling everybody with empathy would be a huge step in gaining world peace. And one of those, like, the surefire way of getting folks to have empathy for other groups of people is to humanize them in a way that's very personal. And I wonder if that could happen if he were forced to live among them. And perhaps forced to, like, pretend as if he were mind blind and not use his powers so that he didn't give himself away. I don't know if that would do anything, but maybe it would be bad for him. It might be that he lives in amongst them and he hears his name used as like a curse amongst people and him being demonized, and he just gets more and more resentful. I don't know. It could backfire. MX Shard says the Mad Sphinx, if I recall, for the title she used to have. I think you're right. Dan says, I think it was just above his pay grade was the impression I got. I definitely think it was meant to be, but he didn't ask, and that was the thing for me. Alustin regrets hurting people he cared about. He still doesn't empathize with his enemies and targets. Yeah, that's it, right? That's exactly, like, I don't know. I feel like I want more from him in terms of his growth. There's something really immature about it. Dan says, who was your favorite character of the main crew? God, that's hard. I really liked Godric. He was just like a sweet guy who he had such a great role model. He had really cool and almost overpowered abilities. I loved too just a subversion of the like meathead jock trope where he's really good at math and that sort of thing. I feel like if I were going to pick somebody to like hang out with, I would pick Godric. Sabe is somebody who ideologically I align with a lot. And I enjoy very much the awkwardness of her not knowing how to flirt and generally just having like a low-level anxiety that she that you wouldn't think a person in her position would have. But she is so serious that I feel like either I would get irritated with her or she would get irritated with me. I would fall into teasing her a little bit, Talia is the there was a tweet a little while ago, and it put the image of like 4 different celebrities, and it was Beyonce, Rihanna, Kim Kardashian, and Nicki Minaj, a weird grouping. And they were like, these 4 are all throwing parties and you get invited to all of them. Which one are you going to? And somebody said, Beyonce, if I've got to go to work in the morning. Rihanna, if I want to get arrested. And that's kind of how I feel about Talia. If I am ready to really go all out and get into some trouble and have like a night that I will never forget, but in the immediate moment might regret, it's Talia, right? Like, she's just the one that is going to always push things a little bit too far And I feel like she's grown in that regard, but she's still who she is. And even if she doesn't, if you're anywhere near her family, you know. So, and I really do appreciate the fact that Talia, like, when everything goes down with her being upset with Hugh for keeping his secret area hostage, that's not really fair, but just keeping it close to the chest. She's the one that, like, comes to him to apologize about the way she acted and how much she overreacted. So she has self-awareness, which is like a must for me to be friends with people in general. They have to. But I do think that she can be on purpose abrasive. And I don't like to use that word because it's tended to use in a misogynistic way. But, like, she has confessed to this herself, that in order to sort of identify as a weapon and dehumanize herself in her own eyes, she can be a little bit too much in certain directions, in almost a manner of, like, self-preservation. And I think I would have a hard time being around somebody like that sometimes. She is aware of it and is growing in terms of it, but it's still something that she struggles with. And dealing with identity issues is always difficult, but when it's the kind of thing that's, like, about violence and your own capability for violence, I'm good. I already have that problem with myself and my bad temper. I feel like she and I might feed off each other in a bad way. You know what I'm saying? And then Hugh is one of those people that I absolutely know I would like and wish the best, but I don't think he and I would get along in a social way. Not to say that like I said, it's not that I wouldn't like him, but he is very, very sensitive and introverted, and we might get along in terms of, like, he's the kind of person that could come over and we can just both sit on the couch and play Switch and not talk, and then that's our hangout, which is valid. But I don't know that I feel like I could hurt his feelings by accident. I feel like I would be constantly hyper aware of how he's feeling and taking things. Like, I would feel so almost protective of him that it would become a job. And I already have that in my life with some friends of mine. I don't need another one. Like I said, I wish the best for him, but he is just, and he's also just, like, straight up, he's so forgiving and such a good person. And I do not feel like I am. I am certainly aspiring to some of the, like, the mindsets that he has regarding forgiveness and regarding moving forward without holding on to bitterness or the expectation of apology or even justice. But I feel like he and I would get in arguments about things like that, you know? Yeah, he's an interesting character because he has such power, and his connection to Candoron is very earned and profound. But I think that would also be sort of a distancing thing from me, is like the fact that he is aligned with such an enormous power would always feel like a bit of a wall. It's difficult to be friends with people who exist on a completely different plane of power than you in general, you know? It's something that I encountered when I was in boarding school, and I was going to school with people who had, like, money, You know, people who lived a life that I simply could not understand. And one of their homes I went to for just an overnight stay, and it was like I had stepped into a different universe. They had a servant, like a live-in servant kind of thing. And I was just like, no wonder she and I just never really connected. It wasn't like we didn't like each other, but we just had a completely different understanding of the world because of it. And Hugh has experienced hardship and been like at the bottom, right? So it's not like he doesn't get it at all. But where he is at with his magic and his connection with her, I don't know if there's any way to like, you know what I mean? It just feels sort of intimidating. MX Shar says, I feel like I'd enjoy bantering with Talia about storytelling tropes. Talia would be a really fun person to watch like soap operas with. She would get very into it. That would actually be a great time. Meanwhile, Sabe would be off to the side being like, I don't understand why they didn't just XYZ. Dan says Talia's fourth wall breaking was so fun. I really liked that. It's the sort of thing that I could see somebody not liking and feeling like it's a little bit too meta and on the nose, which I get, but I didn't have a problem with it. Maybe if he had done it more and it was like excessive, I would have started to be like, okay, calm down. But I do like there was more than one point where the story could have gone in a certain direction, and I was low-key waiting for it to go in that direction, and I appreciated that he acknowledged if we were going to do this the way we would in a story, I would get really mad and stalk off and refuse to listen to you, you know? And that's the exact type of shit that drives me fucking up the wall with storytelling. So there was a part of me that was like, you didn't have to point that out. You could just not do that trope. I couldn't help but like laugh a little bit that he pointed the trope out. There's something in continually pointing it out that makes it clear to me this dude, it's not only the writer being like, that's a trope I'm not doing. But you guys, I know I have like connected this series to Harry Potter a lot, and there are only so many connections before it completely veers off in its own thing. And I'm not trying to say at all that they're like a one-to-one. They're not. But I will say that sometimes it felt like he was sort of like doing a nudge, like this is what Harry Potter did, by the way. Do you remember? Like a little bit. And at this point in my life, dunking on Harry Potter is fine with me. We've, you know, like it's a weird place to be since so much of my brand was built on it. And I really know how I owe that series in a lot of ways for the fact that I'm able to do this full time. But I can't not acknowledge the issues with that series. They all need a hug, says MX Shard, and Dan says the world would be a better place if we all got more hugs. MX Shard says they feel like they'd be fun to binge a series with and talk about it between episodes. Oh my God. So you're saying they'd be talk show hosts? Like they could be podcast hosts. They probably would have a pretty good podcast actually, because there's a good balance in there. Dan says, can you think of a better written parent in fiction than Arthur? It's really funny because so much of what I read, there aren't parents. Like the orphan trope is just so pervasive. And it's either the parent falls down sometimes, there is no parent, or there is, but they are such a non-presence for the most part that they don't count as a full personality. So I'm going to say no. Like, Arthur is not only deeply supportive of his son, but also self-aware, also pragmatic, but sensitive, and the fact that he left a letter specifically being like, if I die, please don't pursue vengeance, is just so well thought out. And not something that I think would necessarily occur to me. Especially considering that, like, at that point, Alustin had not betrayed them all yet. So it would be one thing if he wrote that with the understanding of, like, what that can do to a person. But he knew what it could do to a person without having had to see Alustin and what happened. Which is not to say that Arthur hadn't gotten a full picture from other people in his life who just pursued vengeance endlessly. You know, I'm sure he did. But I really appreciated how he tried to step back and let his son have his own place in the world, because he knew that he was like this overwhelming presence that people were judging Godric by, you know, like using him as a yardstick, and that would put a lot of pressure on his son. That kind of awareness is something that a parent who has reached the kind of height of fame, for lack of a better word, that Arthur had, that's a rare thing. Usually that kind of fame is accompanied by an ego that relishes being the standard that their child is measured by. And I really like the fact that it isn't a factor for him at all. And in fact, he sort of regrets that he has made such a name for himself, you know? Ms. T says, I'm trying to think of any in Cradle that aren't the worst. Yeah, I mean, they're pretty bad. A lot of them. MX Shard says, Sally Jackson is great, but doesn't have much direct presence in the Percy Jackson books. I think I read 2? I might have read 3. But yeah, she's not really around too much. I wouldn't say she's better or worse than Archer, but she's who I think of for good parents in media a lot of the time. And Dan says, Archer just felt like a real dad. He wasn't some bumbling incompetent. He didn't never believe his kids. He was around in his kid's life. He was emotionally intelligent. I really appreciated seeing a normal parent in fiction for once. Yeah, I agree. And, you know, like I said, the whole thing with, like, being orphaned, sometimes the kid doesn't know their parents, didn't know them. Their parents are this complete, like with Harry Potter, he had to hear who his parents were secondhand from people because they died when he was so young. He has no idea about them. And then sometimes you've got a person whose parent died and they idolize them due to that death, and they only seem to remember the good. And so that parent takes on this almost saint-like quality in their memory, which, you know, that's a reality in terms of how we can sometimes be with the way that we remember people, but it's certainly not as interesting to read. And I just really like that Archer was able to keep himself grounded. He's a rock mage, so, you know, it's kind of funny. I did a little pun there. Let's pat myself on the back. Something that I also have wanted to talk about is, and I know that this is, again, not a one-to-one, but you guys, there is a real interesting kind of, with the Harry Potter thing, if we're going to be doing a comparison, we've got somebody like Rhodes, who is a Malfoy-ish type. Do you know who my father is? But what Malfoy goes through, you know, in the Harry Potter books, he is put under immense pressure to kill Dumbledore and can't find a way to do it. And there's almost a sense that he isn't trying that hard because he doesn't like that this is his mission. And it's Voldemort putting the pressure on him explicitly to kind of shame his father. Like, there's a real fatalistic, like, he's not going to be able to do it and he's likely going to die. And that's what you get, you know? And so the fact that Rhodes is bullied by a superior is in alignment with that idea in many ways. But it's not like he's being bullied by the big bad. And it's not like he's being pressured to do bad things that are against his conscience. It's that he is being asked to do something that is far away past the kind of bad thing he's ever done. And it's really interesting to find out that he's being bullied for not upholding an ideal. Like, the nature of it is that you shamed yourself by being a pitiful little weasel, but that he wasn't actually a pitiful little weasel. He was being manipulated in that moment in a way that he couldn't control. So and evidently, what was his name, was aware of that, knew about Bakori's influence. So he's being really manipulated by this teacher who has almost got like a Snape-like vibe to him, but I would not say that he was the Snape at all. I'm just saying, like, that's the sort of mean-spirited, I'm just going to pick on you because I enjoy it sort of energy. And then Rhodes winds up in a way redeeming himself by actually fighting on the right side, but never apologizing for his personal treatment of Hugh, which is an interesting way to do things, because a lot of people talk about Malfoy like redeeming himself, but he doesn't really. In the books, he, up to like the last moment, is ready to throw everybody else under the bus. And I always found it puzzling that people seemed to read it as if he had redeemed himself, when it wasn't true to me at all. There was really no evidence of it. He was always just concerned with keeping himself alive. And Rhodes is like what Malfoy's, his redemption arc could have been, where he does like turn to the other side, but he doesn't ever acknowledge his bullying or anything in a particular way that's like satisfying, because that often isn't the way that things work in life, you know? So it felt almost like Rhodes was like a correction of Malfoy's bungled story, because I feel like people say Malfoy redeemed himself in the end because they feel like that's how it should have gone. And I kind of agree, but I do not think that's borne out by the text. And then in terms of like, you know, the whole thing with Snape and his seeming betrayal and going to the other side, but actually he's a secret agent and he only kills Dumbledore because it's part of an assignment, but he didn't really want to do it. And then, you know, he's like wound up deeply redeemed in the end. There is a feeling of like, and I know that Rashawn and I talked about this, he only cared because of Lily. There was nothing about the way he looked at mudbloods that really seemed to fundamentally change very much. His bigotry it seemed in full force, you know, except for this one person that he had grown to like, which actually does kind of align with the way that we're talking about Alustin not really caring if he hurts anybody except the people that he himself cares about, and having a very like one track view of everything. And Alustin actually betraying them, actually attempting to kill Canderon sincerely and not as part of some major plan, and actually being responsible for the direction that everything goes in, and it not being some huge, overarching, long-term, well thought out plan, is more realistic in general. You want to think that things are all part of a big plan. It's comforting, and there's a sense of like, justification to everything that winds up happening because it was all part of that plan. But the fact that he was straight up doing it for his own reasons and that he actually was ready to hurt and kill everybody, I just feel like I like that better than trying, and it's much more interesting than having somebody that you dislike for the whole series. Snape is a huge bully and an asshole and a bigot. And then it looks like he betrays them, but he hasn't really. And in the end, you find out like, oh, he had, and it's supposed to sort of like wipe away everything. It's much more interesting to have it be somebody that you've liked the whole time, that's genuinely talented, that has actually helped people, and they did this horrific thing. That's a much more complicated thing to deal with, especially because Snape winds up dead. If he had not died, then we'd have to live with the fact that, oh, he had this great plan that he put in place and used to help the resistance against Voldemort, but we see him here still alive and still an asshole. That might have been more effective to keep him alive and just as a terrible person who still walks among us and is insufferable than as somebody who like is a martyr, you know? So let's see. Alex Shard says, another possible question. If you were a warlock in this world, what sort of person would you ideally seek out to pact with? It's such an interesting thing because the way that warlock stuff works in this world, it seems like it's not super consistent all the time, right? Like, evidently, the way that Hugh's magic begins to diminish and go away is seen as evidence that Canderon is no longer alive. So we find out that, like, sometimes you can keep your magic if your pacted partner is dead, but not always. It tends to go away. And so that would play a bit of a role for me as well. Like, how much of a risk am I willing to run? Do I want magic that I know there's a time, like if I'm pacting to a person who has a regular human lifespan, who is susceptible to regular human frailty in terms of what if they just get cancer or have a heart attack? Am I willing to like put the time in to learn how to use a magic when I know it's possibly going to go away? Or am I going to pick a being that's like a lich who's much... Can liches have warlocks? They can, right? Am I wrong? I can't remember how that works. But somebody who's like got a much longer lifespan. Because like the thing is, you automatically think of great powers, but I don't want to be in the mix with the great power shit. It's a mess. It's a target. I'm not interested. So I would want to pick somebody who I feel is going to be around a while, but that isn't like a player. And that's the part that's tricky. So yeah, I'd probably choose somebody who was like a lich who I could have part of their abilities, but is maybe like a lower level lich who's not somebody that anyone really targets in a particular way. And also the fact that like I'm kind of a homebody, I would stay close to the demesne and I would like feel protective of it because it was directly connected to my pacted partner, which just sort of feels right for me and my personality. Just feeling very protective of people that I am close to, you know, as well as simply my connection to their magic. Dan says, who was your favorite side character and why is it Eudaxes? Eudaxes is pretty great. Combo of just like his devotion to Indris, his bizarre and really scary power, and the fact that he is jacked as hell, which is wild. I'm trying to think who, like, because there are so many side characters in this series. What's her name of the Vault? I can't remember her first name. I really, really liked her as a character, and her death hurt. Like, genuinely was a bummer. So I feel like if I could somehow find a way to bring her back, I might do that, even though it's definitely cheapens her sacrifice. I still, Luarna, thank you, Dan. Of course, also, Talia's parents, come on. They're just delightful. Like, I can't help but have a soft spot for characters who I would feel just as comfortable sitting down and having afternoon tea with. And I think it would be just like cozy and adorable. But I know that if anybody were to interrupt with some nonsense, they could level them in an instant and it would barely interrupt them pouring the tea. Like, that's a fucking amazing combo. MX Shard, I think, is in response to Dan, says, I really liked Ava. Her acknowledgement she doesn't want anything to do with high-level shenanigans and setting that boundary for herself, but also maintaining a friendship with Hugh and friends outside of their shenanigans. That's a good point, yeah. And Dan says that's a good one. Another character that felt very real. MX Shard says, pretty sure liches can have warlocks. An independent lich makes sense, especially since it's essentially a bond to your home and community to a degree as well. Eudaxis being secretly shredded was absolutely hilarious. Yeah, that was just so funny. I am never going to not think of what was his name? You guys keep reminding me and I keep forgetting, from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Bobo? Bomi? Boomy, right? Bobo. MX Shard says, oh, Luarna was wonderful. I cried when she died. Talking about how cute the cafe is while they're sieging the city. Right? Exactly. Which, I am not somebody who is, like, I would not be somebody out in battle, very likely. But I do have a temper. And I do have an instinct to mix it up when people are trying to play games. So a part of me feels like their energy is what I strive for a little bit, which I know I won't be nearly as good as they are in actual battle because they devote time to that in a way that I do not. But despite how out of shape I am so, like, I feel like I could give somebody a pretty hard time if they wanted to try and play with me. And it would only take, I have never been in a fight. Rashawn and I have talked about this a few times because she has, unsurprisingly. And her mother is a real big, like, she will take it outside in an instant. Like, so that's where Rashawn has gotten some of that from. I have not been tried in the way that she has. So there's never been a real opportunity for me. But I feel like, if you gave me some just basic pointers, I could be pretty upsetting to somebody's day. So I like that mixture, you know. Dan says, when Bierce eventually gets back around to Mage Errant, should Talia and Hugh still be together when it's years later? Should teen romance survive? That's a good question. Because, you know, it's like, again, going back to the fucking Harry Potter well, there's a lot of people who point out, like, Harry Potter is a character who is like the quarterback on the football team, marries his high school sweetheart, and becomes a cop. And really is not somebody that most of us would like, probably, if they were a real person living in our world and followed the same trajectory in their life. And Hugh being with Talia forever, it's like, I simultaneously don't have that big a problem with it because they are literally bonded in a way now that would make any romantic connection all the more intense, I have to imagine. But also, you change so much as you get older that I can't imagine, with how long they're going to live, I can't imagine remaining monogamous for that long. I feel like if they stay together, I want them to be poly and just cool with that. you know, and they're like dedicated to each other, but they each have their own interests and whatnot. At this point, Hugh does not have the self-confidence for that. He is definitely somebody who feels threatened and is like struggles with their own self-worth. So I don't think that he could be cool with that. And I say this as somebody who myself has all of those same failings and could not be poly. I couldn't do it. I'm too insecure. But I would hope, you know, over the course of centuries, potentially, at least decades, that they could reach a place where they still mean a lot to each other and they still like ultimately come home to one another in a way that's like, you're my rock, but that they are okay with having other people in their lives. MX Shard says, interesting question since Candoron is setting them on a path to immortality / extreme longevity. Right, exactly. Like, it's just unreasonable to a point to expect people to be like, not to say that that could never happen, but it's certainly gotta be pretty rare. And when I think of like the couples that could stick together like that, I'm not sure if it's a healthy thing to aim for or hope for. Unless you're like Gomez and Morticia, you know, or Mr. and Mrs. Russell, if you're somebody who watches The Gilded Age. They are one of those couples that's like, you represent everything I despise, and yet I root for you so hard and love you. Like, I can't help it. It's just such mixed feelings. I think, yeah, that's about an hour up almost. So do you guys have any last points that you want to make or last questions that you want to raise? I also do kind of like, you know, the fact that Candoron indeed survives, I really appreciate, because it's such a thing that like, oh, you have somebody who's teaching you the ropes and eventually they die and now you have to go out on your own. And it's such a trope of like the rite of passage of your mentor no longer being in your life and you have to figure it all out. I do kind of like that they have an opportunity to pursue it on their own, figure it out for themselves, but that she isn't actually gone. I like that because it just, again, subverts things. And the fact that they are facing almost like a never ending life it's such a funny thing to think about how like in Harry Potter, that's Voldemort's ultimate goal is to create a immortality for himself. And that was not even really mentioned as like something to strive for, but then it winds up just being what they get as sort of a matter of course at the end. I just really I think that's funny. Dan says, overall, did you enjoy the series? Oh, definitely. Yeah, I really liked the series and I would definitely recommend it to people. You know, I have my hangups about it that I mentioned at the top, but I think that it's really worthwhile. I like the characters. I definitely need Bierce to get some better, like, beta readers, though. Bierce, call me. I'll help you. Because you just need a little bit of cleaning up. A little bit of pointing things out. It's not a big deal, but it's distracting. So just do that. MX Shard says, people in World talk about the team as being codependent on multiple occasions. That's interesting. Codependent is like a term that I feel gets tossed around a little bit too easily. So I'm not sure I would say that. Like, in a universe where people are targeted the way that they are, I feel like this is just survival tactics and common sense. But you could say that about our universe as well. I don't know. Mentor death curse is a super common trope. Yeah, exactly. I remember a post saying Voldemort would have lived longer if he focused on dieting and exercising instead of soul splitting. That's like, right? That's the thing. When you write a character who's like so invested in that sort of thing, the point I think is that they eschew common sense for magical means. And really the person that we should be looking at if we're doing that is Rob Lowe's character in Parks and Rec. But Dan says, it's been a blast having you read through the series. Glad you enjoyed Mage Errant. See you in the spring for Bastion. Dan, tell me the full name of the series again. Just a reminder for me and so that I can tell everybody what's coming up. But thank you so much for commissioning these. Dan really has kept me afloat this year. The Immortal Great Souls. Thank you. Well, I'm really glad that you enjoyed the coverage. I hope everybody listening did as well. Thank you all. And I'll see you soon. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.